The first city, the first vampire city, the city of Caine, also known as Enoch. This city was similar to those that we would know of today in modern times. Cain was the lawgiver. What he said went. It was similar to that of a prince in modern cities. One of the major differences, though, was in the first city, vampires were revered. The masquerade was not in effect. They were out in the open. The first city was unusual when compared to other cities that preceded it, simply because the city had an active night scene. This was to accommodate the vampires, who were known as gods during this period. The city was also kept dark, and most of the activity that happened at night was from vampires or their servants, their direct servants. We didn't want to have any instances of Rotschreck, also known as the Red Fear. This is the vampire's extreme aversion to fire or to flame. Human life was not to be abused, and vampires were also not to be abused by other vampires or their human counterparts. This was one of Caine's law, and if you broke Caine's law, then you were met with some swift and severe punishment, usually from the second generation vampires, but Caine was also known to deal out punishment himself. This wasn't a law because vampires were concerned about humans and the mortal experience. This was simply a preservation law. There weren't a lot of humans in the early days, and the vampires didn't want to have them running off because they were scared or abused. They needed their vitae to quell the beast inside. You didn't want to have that thing getting loose and wreaking havoc on a city or wreaking havoc on the population when there isn't that many to begin with. One of the more severe forms of punishment was banishment. You could be exiled from the city. This was a problem because there wasn't a lot of human settlements at that time. And Enoch, the first city, was one of the most well protected. Exiled vampires would have to travel, and this exposed them to the elements. It exposed them to the sun, to daylight, which would kill them, if they didn't find a place of rest. If you were exiled, you could also run into the werewolves or other exiles who had been banished before you and somehow managed to live. What is known about the first city in modern days has come from fragments of pottery, from burial sites, from the Nodist scholars, and the clues that they have been able to gather from their places of visitation. Now, the second and third generation vampires, they created a city for themselves. They created a society which would benefit their gifts. It was adapted to their customs, to their strengths. Now, the problem with the first city was there was so many vampires in the city and not enough humans to go around. The third generation was created without Caine's consent. The humans, they started revolting. They were not happy being food sources for their gods because they were also being mistreated now. And then there was the signs, the omens that the Great Flood was coming. Combine that with the strong personalities of the vampires and all of them trying to gain Caine's favor in some way, this was obviously leading to some clashes, which further fueled the human revolt. And the city's hierarchy should also come as a surprise to no one. You had Caine at the top, you had the second generation vampires second, and those would have been Enoch, Zilla, and Irad. And then you had the third generation vampires below them, and Saulot was a big name among the third generation vampires. And below all the vampires, you had humans, but they weren't the lowest rung on the hierarchy ladder. The lowest position belonged to the ghouls. So they've kind of had bad treatment through all vampire history. One interesting story about Caine was that he was able to provide his citizens, the people of Enoch, the first calendar, and this was kind of an advanced calendar. Caines house was circular, and this will be important in a minute. What Caine did on one midsummer night is he painted a line with his own blood on the wall. Every day that line would move. It would slowly make circles around the house, letting him know of important events, the solstice, harvest season, the approaching winters. The first city was an agricultural city. It had to be to sustain the human lives that were there. On every new moon, Caine would have a big party at his house. And after every eclipse, there would also be a great Thanksgiving, some bountiful harvest that they would have at his place. Enemies of Cain and the first city, they used these celebrations as opportunities to attack. You can thank the werewolves for that. And human breeding was also experimented with during the time of the first city. How did it work? Did it work with other kindred? Which they found out it didn't. They experimented with breeding of humans for specific roles, being warriors in the armies to defend the city, being food suppliers for the vampires that lived in the cities. And if you were good at what you were doing, you might be selected to further your own lineage, further your family line. And you would be taken to the Temple of Lilith to do this. And within this temple, you had ritual copulation. And then you would never see that person again, or the offspring. Now, while the first city had a temple to Lilith, there was no religion per se allowed within the city, especially not the worship of God. Cain really took the curse he got from God and really held on to a grudge there. Now, Cain's house was more of a palace, really. It was known as Dread Palace Gamal. It is said that there were 5 levels of this house, and no one knew what the 5th level was used for. On the first, this is where you had your feasts. This is where honored guests would dine, as well as honored victims for being food. The first level also served as Irad's court, where he would guide, where he would lead the armies of Cain. And in the middle of this floor, Cain had an ivory throne. The second level provided lavish accommodation, a splendid place to be if you were one of these select 200 or so vampires. The third floor is where the humans would be fed by the antediluvians, and level 4 was reserved for Cain himself. Now, Cain City, the city of Enoch, would eventually become destroyed not once, but twice. The first time happened with the flood, the great deluge, the biblical rainwaters that washed away humanity, or most of it anyways. When the waters finally receded, humanity built a new city. Now, this is rumored to have either been close to or even on top of the original site of Enoch. This city was then taken over by the 3rd generation vampires, or the antediluvians as they are come to be known. Even in the physical plane, the material world, Enoch was destroyed. However, in the underworld, Enoch still existed. In the underworld, known as the Shadowlands, the first city came under the rulership or the stewardship of an immortal being, and I'm gonna pronounce the name wrong just so you all are aware of this. I know it's wrong. Give me a second. Inauhatan. Inauhatan. It's written on the screen there. You try it. This was an immortal being, a mummy. He would later be found or sought out by a group of mages called the Idran. They would eventually become known as the Telmare, but they sought the knowledge of immortality that he had. The immortal being, Inauhatan. Let's say it that way now. He agreed to share his secrets with them as long as they became protectors of the city in the Shadowlands, which they accepted. It would be much later in human history that the Telmare would be driven out of this city, nearly exterminated, and Enoch would be taken over by a different sect, Del Ro. This would have been in the period of the 3rd Great Maelstrom. I have done a video talking about them up here, and links will also be in the description. However, the city wouldn't be fully destroyed until much later in time. That brings us into the modern day, the 6th Great Maelstrom. This is where the city would be destroyed by a relic nuclear bomb. It was detonated in the Shadowlands, and this caused a cascade of events. The 6th Great Maelstrom would end Stygia. Enoch was destroyed. Blacktooth, the Simba in Africa, witnessed this explosion and it drove him mad, and most of the Black Hand would also be destroyed from this event. Now, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Cain, how he was cursed by God, click on the video on your screen now. I would like to thank my brand new patron, Coin. Thank you for joining at the Maple Wolf level. My name's Nathaniel. Thanks for stopping by, everyone.